Good afternoon. My name is Cecilia Tortajada, professor in practice at the School of Social and Environmental Sustainability of University of Glasgow. I would like to thank our speakers today for contributing to this webinar and to all of you for joining us today. This webinar will focus on critical aspects of water security, what this means in the context of international and interstate rivers. What are the collaborative efforts necessary to ensure sustainable management of these river systems? Examples will include the Colorado River Basin, the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, and the Hindukush Himalayas. And within this, India and its very complex management of interstate rivers. To make the introductory remarks, I would like to introduce Professor Fabrice Renaud, Head of the School of Social and Environmental Sustainability and Professor of Environmental Risk and Community Resilience. Fabrice, thank you for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, and good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone joining us on this new session of our water webinar series, which will be addressing the subject of water security in transboundary and interstate rivers. The systems that we will be discussing today are key to ensuring water security at the local level and to allow achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. However, first, it's important to note that there are 310 international river basins globally that cover approximately 47% of the Earth's land surface when we exclude Antarctica, and representing an estimated 60% of global freshwater flows and comprising 52% of the world's population. So this is really to showcase the extent, the geographical extent and population these systems supply and their significance globally. Second, it is clear that sustainable access to water is necessary for socioeconomic development and ecosystem health. And for this, water resources should be managed properly. Water crossing political boundaries are the layer of complexity to water management, particularly because there are geopolitical considerations. And for interstate rivers, there are national politic considerations, which are sometimes even more complicated to address. Third, water management or mismanagement in international river basin does not only affect water security, but can also threaten many different landscapes. As an example, this is the case for river deltas, where water and sediment diversion upstream and within the deltas themselves can threaten the very physical existence of these systems with huge negative consequences for populations living there. So it's not only about water security, but it's also about the existence of these very important landscapes globally. Fourth, with climate change, more erratic rainfall and potential for more frequent and intense floods and droughts require more collaborative water management between different riparian countries and states. This includes water allocation under changing conditions, which is happening very slowly globally. In fact, water allocation agreements between countries or regions within countries do not systematically consider extreme hydrometeorological events resulting from climate change. Fifth, outside of climate change consideration, water security in many countries on transboundary and interstate rivers is already threatened by water scarcity, water pollution, and poor management of water resources. So this adds a complication to the problematic we're going to be discussing today. So overall, there is an urgent need to understand and address water security concerns in these transboundary systems and to find solutions to work collaboratively for the sustainable management of shared water resources. So this webinar will allow us to learn more on this topic through concrete examples as outlined by Cecilia, and that will be provided by distinguished experts in this field. So I will conclude here. I thank you for your attention. I very much look forward to an interesting discussion with the panelists, but also with the public who is listening in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Haris. Thank you for your remarks. We will now start our discussion with our panel members. Each one of the panel members will make a brief presentation on the management of different river systems. This will be followed by questions and answers by myself, by other panel members, and by all of you in the audience. And before ending, I will ask each one of our panel members to make the final remarks. Our first speaker is Professor Neil S. Grigg. Neil is Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Colorado State University. His professional career of more than 50 years includes positions in academia as professor, department head, assistant dean, and Water Institute director. In government, at the state level as an assistant secretary for natural resources and director of Division of Environmental Management. In business, as a co-founder of a consulting engineering firm, and in the military as a U.S. Corps of Engineer Army officer. Neil has served as the U.S. Supreme Court River Master of the Pecos River since 1988. He has authored 17 books in the fields of water resources and infrastructure, the most recent in 2023 as Water Resources Management Principles, Methods, and Tools. Neil, the floor is yours. And again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Cecilia. It's really great to participate on this panel on this really important subject. I mean, climate change and all of these transboundary rivers that we're talking about, they affect so many billions of people around the globe. My presentation about the Colorado River contains a lot of important lessons, I think, unique to the United States and any country that has a federal form of government like we have in the United States. I think we have a map that can be shown of the Colorado River basin to illustrate the setting there. That's the map, and it occupies a big portion of the southwestern part of the United States. There are 7 states that are involved. The basin is divided into an upper basin and a lower basin. It flows into Mexico down at the outfall at the bottom in the Gulf of California. And in addition to the states that are there, we have numerous Native American tribes that have vested water rights in the basin, so that the transboundary nature of the flows in this basin are extremely complicated. I mean, you can imagine the difficulties among the different states, the international flow to Mexico, and the tribes, which are autonomous and have sovereignty within the states due to the unique political setting of the United States. So if you look at the map and you think about the upper basin and the lower basin, you can get a good idea of the setting that begins at the top in the state of Wyoming, in Colorado, where we have high mountains and snowpack and runoff there that supplies a big share of the water in the basin. And then it flows from there to the south through some very dry country. And eventually, when it's time for it to flow into Mexico, it's very arid down there. And as I'm going to explain, this division of the basin into the 2 parts has proved to be a very important part of resolving the transboundary issues there. So to think about the challenges that we have in that basin, the way to think about it is all the competing water users among there, with this area of tremendous growth in the United States. In the upper part, the competition for water is largely mixed between large cities like Denver, and that's one of the major ones in the upper part there. But a lot of agricultural uses, environmental uses in that upper part. The lower part it has more demand on the water because it has more large cities. It's got Los Angeles, it's got San Diego, it's got Las Vegas, it's got Phoenix, Arizona, and all those big cities are competing with agricultural water users. And so you have a very complex situation where competition is not only among the cities and between the cities and the agricultural users, but also between the different states in the upper part and the lower part. And then when you consider that the three levels of government are all integrally involved, federal government, state government level, and local government level, then the governance challenge is really difficult. So what has happened in this basin over time is the conflict developed early on, as you can imagine, with the development of the United States as a country. And by the 1920s, it was apparent that if something wasn't done to put into place some mechanisms to control the competition of water, that it would be a chaotic situation. So the first Interstate Water Compact of the United States was developed and signed in 1922. They found that the United States Constitution had a provision for compacts between states. They didn't have in mind when they set that up in the beginning in the Constitution that it would necessarily deal with water, but it fit water pretty well. So as a result of that, now we have a number of interstate water compacts, and they are pretty much a precedent for how to implement that part of the national Constitution. Our Constitution is now about 250 years old, so we're still trying to make it better than it is, but at least it's holding together. So in 1922, when they set up that original compact, they divided the water half to the upper basin states and half to the lower basin states, and with a portion to Mexico. Now, that proved to be a politically expedient mechanism for them to implement at the time, because it provided something at least that we could work with. Initially, the hydrology in the basin was relatively stable, but the amount of water that they promised to the upper basin and the lower basin was more than has proved to be available in recent years, especially due to climate change. And so what has happened now is they promised 15 million acre feet. That's a unit we use in the United States. 1 acre foot is about 1,200 cubic meters. If you convert that, millions of acre feet convert pretty much into billions of cubic meters. Promised 15 million acre feet to the two basins and 1.5 million acre feet to Mexico there. And it proved okay for a few years, but in recent years, the amount of water that's been available has been more like 12 million acre feet. And until this year, which has been extremely wet, everyone was really concerned about it, and it was the longest and deepest drought that we have seen. It's been a 22-year drought, and we hope it doesn't return next year. So the real question that we're facing with this Colorado River Basin is how can you resolve the kind of very difficult issues within a federal system of government? Now, you might think, well, if you had a commission or something to resolve the conflicts, that would work. But the Colorado River Basin doesn't have a commission to govern the whole basin. The states have to negotiate among themselves. And the federal government, which has an agency, the Bureau of Reclamation, that has a lot of reservoirs and water management, they have to figure out what they should do and what their role would be. We don't have all of that figured out. I think the lesson that I would conclude with here is just that we need to figure out the roles of these different levels of government within this system of highly competitive competition for the water in a system where water rights have been granted as property rights. I should have said that earlier, but in the different states, the water rights and the entitlement are property rights. So this makes everybody extremely keen to hold on. So with that, I'll conclude my introduction to that river and be ready to answer any questions as well as listen carefully to the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. We will go back to the next presentation, but at the end, I will come back to you with a question. After a 22-year drought, there must have been so many lessons learned, either from the institutional perspective, water allocation, how to communicate with users. So, and many other, because 22 years is a long time. So when I come back to you, could you please explain that to us? What have been those main instruments that can stay if there is another drought? So something that has stayed institutionally or legally. So we're going to go now to Aysegul, but I will come back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Aysegul Kibaroglu. Aysegul is Professor of International Relations at Middle East University. She has a visiting professorship at University of Texas at Austin. She is the author of numerous works on international waters in the Tigris and Euphrates. One of them, building a regime for the waters of the Euphrates Tigris River Basin. And she is also co-editor of Turkey's water policy. Very important, Aysegul is a founding member of the Euphrates Tigris Initiative for Cooperation. Aysegul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Thanks for the kind invitation. I'm very delighted to be among the esteemed colleagues and the interested audience. Maybe we can start with we will show the map, but this is the Euphrates and Tigris River Basin. It is situated in the Southwest Asia, but politically called for probably more than 2 centuries as the Middle East. And it's one of the crucial river basins, one of the major river basins in the Middle East. And it hosts the countries like Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and many diversified communities. And I should also start with the fact that the waters of the rivers, Euphrates and Tigris, there are 2 rivers, and it's an interesting basin. Some geographers consider it as a single basin, or some politicians consider it as a single basin, but the others may consider it as 2 separate basins. This has become an issue in water diplomacy negotiations as well. Yet, we can see that they are connected, the 2 rivers, geographically as well. They start very close to each other in the highlands of Turkey, and they join together by man-made canal near Baghdad in Iraq, and they also make and merge one river, the famous and very valuable Shatt al-Arab, before they empty into the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. They are strategic rivers for all countries that I try to mention. It is one of the river basins among 25 in Turkey, but it makes 1/3 of the water in Turkey, fresh water, surface water, and 1/5 of the arable area. For Iraq, this is the only freshwater resource, Euphrates and Tigris. So it is completely vital. For Syria, it is one of the 7 basins, but it's again one of the major river basins which feeds into agriculture and hydropower. And the water question problem emerged on this river basin when 3 major riparians started large-scale development projects in the end of 1960s. On the other hand, the water issue was not in the political vacuum, and it was happening during the Cold War. So there had been political linkages established between transboundary issues and non-riparian security issues, which really exacerbated the disagreements, because 2 southern riparians like Syria and Iraq were with Soviet Union, while Turkey was with NATO, and it was causing problems as well in terms of developing the relations. And in terms of diplomatic crisis, we can spot the first diplomatic crisis. Luckily, it was only diplomatic when during the development, during the construction and filling of the first large-scale dams, both in Turkey and Syria upstream, this caused a huge anxiety in the downstream riparian Iraq. And it actually caused a severe diplomatic crisis, the filling of the first two dams, one of the largest in the world. And the two Ba'athist regimes, they were two Ba'athist regimes, but they were in rivalry. They came to the brink of war, but it wasn't actually related to water altogether, but water was used as a lever, political leverage in this dispute. It was mediated. It didn't turn into hot conflict. But in 1975, there is an episode which really Saddam sent his troops to the Syrian border. And because Iraq was too anxious, it asked for a platform to discuss water issues. And in 1980s, the three riparians managed to build a joint technical committee, Interstate committee, to discuss the water issues. However, this joint technical committee they didn't agree on the mandate of this committee, and it was not clear what this committee will be busy with. And this committee did not help to clarify the needs and the priorities, but there had been a series of water negotiations all through the 1980s. And also there's another significant development in the basin in the 1980s, that they signed two bilateral water sharing agreements, one between Turkey and Syria, which divided Euphrates into which Turkey agreed to give half of the Euphrates flow, and the one between Syria and Iraq, which divided the Euphrates in percentages. And when we analyze these agreements, we see that unfortunately, even though they signed these water agreements, which shows an agreement, but they didn't settle the differences, and the agreements did not deal with the necessary issues such as water quality and especially drought management. And it didn't consider the fluctuations in the flow, which is happening very frequently in the basin. So it fell short of dealing with the today's climate change, but in the past, it has been always severe droughts. There has been a significant political change in the early 2000s, a positive change. And at the highest decision-making level, especially between Turkey and Syria, there had been a political rapprochement. And this also was reflected in water relations, and water bureaucracies caught this opportunity, and they managed to sign some protocols, which was great progress in the first decade of the 2000s. And this time it was not sharing protocols like the sharing protocols of 1980s, but the protocols of 2000s were actually dealing with how to manage the existing limited water resources by referring to drought management, quality management, environmental protection. But these protocols unfortunately proved to be impossible to implement due to the regional instability and increased political tensions between the riparians and in the region. And after years of deadlock in these transboundary relations, especially during the American invasion in Iraq, but also especially during the Syrian civil war, the Turkey and Iraq found an opportunity, and they tried to start a new dialogue on water relations as well, and they signed a new protocol to deal with the water issues on the Tigris and on the Euphrates. And they put issues like assessment of the existing water resources, how to reach common assessment of the water flow and quality, calibration of data, building joint dams, such issues since 2014. So coming to my conclusions, I have some conclusions such as this case study in the so-called Middle East demonstrates that even in the absence of harmonious relations and political stability, which is a big issue here in this region, at least since the early 2000s, but even before, since Iran-Iraq war, various institutions among concerned actors could be established. Somehow the riparians found a way to use diplomacy mechanisms, such as building the Joint Technical Committee, the formal one, and signing the water bilateral protocols, which were not very helpful to deal with water problems, but it was a sign of peace. And also in the first decade of 2000s, again, the official memoranda. But there were also initiatives from track 2, the informal diplomacy. This is also a sign of how the riparian states, professionals, academics, civil society is trying to deal with the water resources. Cecilia mentioned that I was one of the founding members of one of these initiatives. There are actually a couple of such initiatives which I'm gladly foresee, which is called Euphrates and Tigris Initiative for Cooperation. My conclusions I can also discuss later on, but I just recommend and strongly recommend to build on and strengthen the existing transboundary institutions, if necessary, revitalize and strengthening them, such as the Joint Technical Committee, and turn them into multilateral platforms for implementing water cooperation. And compared to the water sharing agreements of the 1980s, the protocols which were completed but could not be implemented in the 2000s have a broader outlook with an integrated water resources management, and they can be synthesized into a multilateral treaty. And in order to reach such a synthesis, there is a need to involve stakeholders. So the lessons learned is that not only states, the riparian states, but the other stakeholders, civil society, farmers, private sector, which is very significant in this part of the world, should be involved when the states or the other involved parties sitting around the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aysegut. Aaron Wolf at Oregon University, he says that there are countries that don't speak on many aspects, but they do in terms of water, because it's essential. And this is what you have explained very well, the different different instruments, the different initiatives. So we will go to the next presentation, but then I will come back to you. And if you can explain to us, how does water cooperation look, or how can it look in times of climate change? If we have an extended drought, how this water cooperation can be developed in the basins. So thank you again, and now we go with Dr. David Molden. David is a research for development specialist with more than 30 years of experience in designing, planning, executing, and monitoring programs on water and natural resources management, with enormous work experience across Asia and Africa. David was Director General of the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICIMOD, from 2011 to 2020. And prior to joining ICIMOD, he was a Deputy Director General for Research at the International Water Management Institute, IMI. IMI received the 2011 Crystal Drop Award by the International Water Resources Association, and in 2012, he received the Stockholm Water Prize. David has contributed to the publication of more than 200 works in books, journals, reports, media, and educational material. He's an honorary member of the International Water Resources Association and has received many awards, including the Outstanding Scientist Award of the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, CGIAR, in 2009. David, thank you very much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Cecilia, for having me. Excuse me. I'd like to relate my experience using knowledge networks to enhance transboundary cooperation. And overall, this was a great experience, and drawn from my work at the International Center for Integrated Mountain, ICIMOD, where I was Director General for 9 years, ending in 2020. ICIMOD specializes in mountain resources, including water of the Hindukush Himalaya. And the mountains are shared by 8 countries: Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, Myanmar, Nepal, and Pakistan. It's a unique organization because the board of directors is drawn from government ministries in each of those different countries. And the work is actually aimed at fostering cooperation across countries for to improve environment and livelihoods. This is important for knowledge networks because when we set them up, we did have sanction from the different governments working there. So the Hindukush Himalaya, you saw a map earlier, is the source of 10 major river basins. Most of these cross international borders. About 2 billion people live in these river basins. If you think about Yellow, Indus, Ganges River, and so it's very important what happens in mountains and how that impacts the downstream. We did a lot of work on the Indus River and the Koshi River, a tributary to the Ganges, and with the Indus shared by China, Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan, and the Koshi by China, Nepal, and India. And while our work focused typically on mountain environments, we also looked how this would influence the downstream plains. All these river basins share many challenges. One is the fragile mountain environment, very difficult mountain livelihoods and high rates of poverty and outmigration, high vulnerability to all kinds of disasters, floods, droughts, earthquakes, landslides, etc. And the area is highly vulnerable to a rapidly changing climate. So it's projected that by 2100, if we could reach a 1.5 degree world, already we'd be losing half of the glaciers in this region. And then again, most of the rivers are transboundaries. Just for an example, in the Indus, there are very strong upstream and downstream linkages. So the water is generated in the mountains, is used downstream, serving one of the largest contiguous irrigation systems in the world, the largest. It's ranked as the most vulnerable basin to climate and cryospheric change in the world. So in the Indus Basin, about 60% of water is derived from snow and ice in the upper Indus Basin. And with changes in precipitation, there's a high uncertainty with regards to water availability and timing. In addition, what is expected is that we'll see a doubling of flood intensities by 2100. So let's talk about cooperation on the Indus River, right? Of course, it has the Indus Water Treaty, which is one of the most enduring international agreements, except it has no arrangement for the Kabul River flowing into the Indus. But the geopolitical sensitivity is extremely high, and you picture that's a very difficult place to work across borders. And like other transboundary rivers, it leaves knowledge gaps and gives rise to misunderstandings and misperceptions, which actually fuel that geopolitical sensitivity. So, a lot of times you'll hear news and politicians love the kind of story about how one country will take water from the other country. So without cooperation, it can be very difficult to understand key processes in a basin. For example, with climate change, what are the impacts of melting glaciers downstream when the glaciers are in a different country? Or when is a flood coming? So the idea is, could we somehow approach that through a knowledge network? And our thinking was that through this knowledge network, we could contribute to lessening these knowledge gaps and thereby contribute to sustainable development. The aim is to build trust, to build communication links, and to help generate knowledge and share solutions. And a great example of this, I think, is the Arctic Council with its 8 countries who also rely on a lot of scientific evidence. We set up an Upper Indus Basin network. It takes some time to set up. It started in 2010, at first only in Pakistan. And already in Pakistan, it helped organizations in Pakistan work together, from upstream and downstream stakeholders. Different administrative bodies had a chance to talk together, as well as connect with different universities and NGOs. And in the end, actually, a very active gender group emerged that participated in Pakistan. But in 2017, the Upper Indus Basin Network was broadened to include 4 basin countries: Pakistan, India, China, and Afghanistan. And each had their country chapters. The 4 countries endorsed a governance framework with a steering committee. They agreed on core values to make this work. And they actually started on research about climate change impacts on livelihoods in upper mountain communities in Ladakh and Baltistan, in Baltistan. Of course, COVID slowed down the progress, but I think it's starting to pick up momentum again. From looking at that Indus experience, but also experience across ICIMOD, where we had similar networks looking at biodiversity conservation or water, where we found that like in Turkey, the Tigris-Euphrates River, in spite of that difficult geopolitical situation, there are openings, right? Safe spaces to talk about. For example, you can talk nicely about biodiversity and environment. Disasters are important to talk about between countries, and countries appreciated that. Sharing experience on community livelihoods. There's great opportunities to discuss science, right? The science of mountains or water. And I believe that climate change, if there is a positive side, has actually been a trigger to bring people in mountain environments closer together, because people are wondering what's happening in mountains. So let's see if we can learn from one another about melting glaciers. So I think at ICIMOD, we had a lot of success in building partnerships, trust, sharing knowledge across countries, especially about climate change and in the region. And just one great example was community-based flood early warning systems that were developed in the Koshi River. They spread to Assam, they spread into Nepal, they actually did communities across India and Nepal, communicated each other on floods. It worked in Pakistan and really worked in several instances. So it was a great example of knowledge communication. So in conclusions, I believe that this kind of knowledge network does have an important role and can contribute to transboundary water management. My experience is even in geopolitical sensitive areas, it can work, but you probably have to pick the topics, right? Start with less contentious issues like environment or disasters. Community climate change was important, and it does take a lot of patience, and because things change, but results can enhance our knowledge. We can avoid misunderstandings and hopefully contribute to improved basin-wide management. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. You brought a very important element to the discussion, which is knowledge, science, and the networks, and how important this is for practical situations. That is what knowledge is for. And I remember you discussing many times the importance of the in the floodplain, so what is happening in the mountains. So of course it is the mountains, but then what happens with the water that comes from there. And after our last presentation, and once I come back to you, if you can please also explain to us how these knowledge networks, how can they be brought to the people? Because at the end, people, we the citizens, many times we don't know, and people are concerned. So how can these knowledge networks can be brought basically to the population? But thank you very, very much again, and I'll come back to you. Thank you, David. Our last panel member, Dr. Srinivas Chokakula. Srinivas is a senior fellow at the Ministry of Jal Shakir Research Chair of Water Conflicts and Governance at the Center for Policy Research in Delhi, where he leads the Transboundary Rivers, Ecologies, and Development Studies program, a research cluster founded by him. Srinivas' research and policy interests lie primarily in the water sector, focusing on transboundary water conflict, cooperation, and governance. He has written and published widely on the subject. Srinivas, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you for having me on this really distinguished panel. It's truly an honor. I'd like to start with my own map. That's the map of India, showing the India's river basins overlaid by the boundaries, state boundaries. And what you're looking at is 20 river basins shared by um, 29 states and 7 union territories. So together, it's 36 territorial entities. So the point that I'm trying to drive at is that the India's long-term water security interests lie in the realm of interstate river water governance, and a very effective resolution of interstate disputes is central to its interests. So it's not just about, as I think Neil had mentioned about it. It's also relevant to other federations that you see in the other map, where more than 25 federations governed by federal political systems, cover the entire world, as you can see. So we can take off the slide if you want to, but so to speak to interstate river water disputes in India specifically, I think the best is to sort of use the current escalation of Kaveri river water dispute between the states of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. I mean, as we speak now, today, the city of Bangalore, belonging to Karnataka, is shut down, and 200 people have been arrested. I mean, this is in protest against the directions that were given to the upstream state of Karnataka to release Kaveri waters to Tamil Nadu for the next couple of weeks at the rate of close to 3,000 cusecs. Now, this is this is a very reflective. In fact, Kaveri water disputes is one of those long drawn disputes. I mean, it has a long history. It started somewhere in 1960s, and then in 1990, a quasi-judicial institution was set up, which is a tribunal was set up. And then after 27 years, a final decision was given with clear allocations to the two states and two other party states. Yet, even after the final decision by the judicial institutions, you see these kind of recurrence and escalation of the disputes. The dispute and Kaveri dispute is kind of very as an example. I mean, the rest of the 9 disputes that India has had so far in the past several decades, since the 1956, since the law that was enacted to resolve disputes. I mean, these disputes are no different. What we found is that the problems that are associated with interstate river water disputes resolution and the ineffectiveness is that the policies suffer from long-drawn legal battles. I mean, the way I mentioned about Kaveri dispute. And the second one is that, there is an absence of mechanisms, particularly the institutional mechanisms to ensure compliance of the states with the decisions that are given by the judicial institutions. The third is, the politicization of the dispute itself. Interstate river water disputes are very popular and potent sites of political mobilization. And the fourth one is that, it's not often acknowledged, but these disputes, the episodes themselves, these disputes incur huge costs to the public exchequer. You're talking about one episode of escalation, the one that we are witnessing, costs something like anywhere close to 3 to 6 billion US dollars. That's the kind of costs that are involved. So this challenge of interstate river water disputes has been at the core of our research efforts. And then what we find, the broader reasons why the policy ecosystem that's out there is not effective, is that there are three broader reasons that I could list down here. One is that there has been an excessive reliance on law, in the sense that India has always resorted to legal responses, like relying on the judicial institutions. Incidentally and interestingly, Indian constitution provides for barring of the jurisdiction of the courts over interstate river water disputes, in spite of the fact that the constitutional writers felt that the courts cannot produce satisfactory outcomes when it comes to interstate river water disputes. In spite of the fact that, why the Supreme Court continues to engage with interstate river water disputes is a separate discussion altogether. The second reason why the status of affairs continue is that the history has always been also quite focused on conflict resolution, in contrast to enabling cooperation. So if just like the track record that we have seen in the international water conflicts in the transboundary river basins, the number of disputes in India are far lesser compared to the number of interstate agreements. You're talking about 9 interstate river water disputes since the independence that required constitution of these tribunals for adjudicating of these disputes. In contrast to that, we have had close to 190 interstate agreements that do not often receive attention either from policy discourse or even scholarship for that matter. So in spite of, if you look at the track record, the response of the policy has always been to improve conflict resolution rather than strengthening the ecosystem for enabling cooperation. The third one, as the way we see, is that we haven't adequately invested in understanding the problem itself, the theorization of the problem itself. And if you look at the body of work that has been produced by the international relations and geographers, the scholarship tells you that the binaries of conflict and cooperation no longer are valid in the context of transboundary water sharing. Conflict and cooperation coexist. So it's just impossible for you to rely on simple legal responses, but instead we are expected to sort of supplement the legal responses with political and institutional avenues. And on the basis of that, we have had several recommendations, but they are very specific to Indian context. I guess I'm close to my time, so I would stop here and then over to Cecilia.
Thank you, Srinivas. You pointed, thank you. Again, you brought new elements as David did before. You explained that there are not so many international mechanisms, and you explained all the, but there are mechanisms for conflict management. So when I come back to you, could you explain to us how come is it that there are mechanisms for conflict management, but not for the previous step, and one step before, which is precisely the management? We may not have to come to the conflict management if the discussions on the management, on the allocation came before. And what you said is very true. Whenever there is a conflict, not only the media, but the academia picks it up as if there were all these water wars in the world, which is not the case. So we also, from the academia, we should be much more precise on what we are talking or discussing. So thank you very, very much again. And I would like to go back to Neil and about his presentation. And my question at that point, Neil, if you could explain to us these instruments that have been developed during these 22 years of drought.
The lessons during the 22 years of drought, there are many lessons, of course, and it was very interesting to hear all of the diverse situations from all of our speakers here. And there are a lot of commonalities. One that occurred to me about the 22-year drought is the difficulty in knowing when a drought begins, so some work can actually start. it seems to be in the best interests of all the stakeholders to deny that the drought has really started, so they kind of hope that everything will be okay and they don't do anything. The second lesson that comes out of the experience that I was reporting on is when you have actual property rights involved as opposed to just stakeholders, it really becomes extremely difficult because the people who feel that they're threatened to lose their water, they have a lot of legal mechanisms as well as political mechanisms that they can use to stop things. The last lesson which occurred to me is one that David was talking about with these knowledge networks. And I was thinking it's good to have a continuing dialogue even during the drought so that you're ready when something happens. But politically speaking, it's difficult to get the people together because they don't want to get together. But if you can have the knowledge networks going that would work underneath the radar screen in order to just provide the information, share the information, get it out to the public, like you said, Cecilia, I think that would go a long way toward providing some means to resolve things, even in this deep drought.
Thank you, Neil. David, can you bring David to the discussion about these knowledge networks? What Neil just mentioned, David, is very important, right? If at a certain level there is no decision making with the knowledge networks, then we can bypass more. What's your opinion on that?
Well, yeah, I think it opens up doors of communicate. I mean, politically, things may be very difficult and stopped, right? But at least you're talking in the background. Now, if you're persistent and wait a long time, maybe there's an opportunity where the political doors open, and then you can move forward with some stronger agreements. But I think in the background, if you can continue to share knowledge and information and have that communication channels open, that you can actually make progress through these difficult times. So I found that as quite positive, right? So and I like what Neil was thinking. You could have those channels open, working in the background during difficult times as well.
Thank you very much. And also Isaac will presented a very complex situation because it's a complex basin, much more complex than the one Neil presented. And so what are these opportunities that exist, Isabel, in terms of water diplomacy or knowledge networks? What complexity? Can it be an opportunity?
Thanks, Cecilia. Yeah, there is this. I tried to summarize briefly the hydropolitical history, and it shows that contemporary history, even between the most contentious riparians like Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, there is a possibility of dialogue and cooperation, and they proved that they kept dialogue. But on the other hand, there is this reality of climate change, and it is definitely adding complexity, and it also, we cannot guarantee that the past institutions can work and they didn't work properly, and how they will deal with this climate change in this part of the world. And Euphrates Tigris is spotted by Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change as one of the hotspots. It will lose a lot of water in the Tigris and Euphrates in a very short period of time. Like 1/4 of the water in Tigris will be over, and in the Euphrates as well, because there is this problem of snow. It is not snowing as usual, and the timing of the snow is changing. So this is a huge problem. And as you mentioned, it also inspires me the understanding that climate change is a huge problem, but between the states, between the riparian states, it is so far perceived as a common threat and common problem. Compared to the water sharing, water allocation, it was always a very contentious issue, how to share the water multilaterally or bilaterally. But climate change is perceived as a common threat. However, so far there is no systematic or joint efforts to deal with climate change. There are episodes in the history, recent past, to deal with droughts, that sometimes Iraq asks more water from Turkey, referring to the prolonged droughts in the area, or sometimes they ask for postponing the filling of the last dam, or changing the operations of the dams. To my nice knowledge, that Turkey responds positively. But these are temporary policies, and there is no permanent institution to deal with the increasing effects of climate change. There are some temporary responses, which is good. They are dealing it as a common threat and trying to respond it. But those are still like band-aid situations, and it's not systematic.
Thank you. And if Srinivas can tell us, within India, are there also these temporary responses? And this is for Srinivas.
Cecilia, could you please repeat it?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. I would just mention that in the case of the Tigris, Euphrates river basins, there have been temporary responses because of climate change, because there is less water. Is this something that you see in the case of India between the states?
Well, not at the moment, certainly, but there are these common interests that are emerging, which are, in the form of risks that are particularly, as in the recent times, perhaps, I don't think climate change has gained so much traction as more immediate challenges like dam safety, for example. And I hear also reports about more concerns about water quality between the states. So there are these risks that are likely to produce some level of collective effort. But in terms of, national responses, as I did mention in my presentation, it has been fairly consistently about improving the dispute resolution mechanisms rather than, figuring out ways of mobilizing collective action between states. As I missed to mention this, but the legislation that was put in place to resolve the conflicts has been amended more than 8 times. The 9th amendment is under consideration by the Parliament as of now. But whereas there is the other legislation which is meant to enable cooperation, which is called River Boards Act 1956, it has never been used nor amended. There has never been focus of strengthening this interstate cooperation as such.
And I would like to, in relation to the comment you made about the problems because of the Kaveri, there is a comment by one of the persons who have joined us as a viewer. Just today, we were in the midst of a state with banda or protests called for shutdown of public services, restaurants, offices, schools in Bangalore, over release of water from the Kaveri Karnataka to downstream Tamil Nadu in compliance with agreements. Good timing for this webinar and looking forward to discussion. So it is a topic that is of concern for many people. And I would like to go to some of the questions that have been posed for all of you. One of them, and this will be for any of you who want to answer. Transboundary institutions seem vital, but multilateralism is faltering globally. Can multiple bilateral agreements work hydrologically in a transboundary setup? David, because of this internationalization, this question, could you make a comment on it?
Yeah, I think, it's sometimes discouraging these days when seems like we need more cooperation, that it seems faltering. But I think every effort we can take to have that kind of communication between countries. I don't think it necessarily always has to be treaties and agreements that will make it work. But if we can just move in that direction of sharing knowledge, communicating, opening channels, I think it will bring us back to a better situation. I just relate the experience at ISIMAD, where we often had a lot of contentious issues between countries, but at least ICIMOD was a place that you could talk together, and hopefully someday we'll come back to a better track on it. So I believe that these networks can definitely help in the long run.
They can, as you said, to speak, but also from the scientific point of view, from the production of science, the production of evidence, right, for the countries to know what is the situation.
Yeah, so I think behind the scenes in the mountain areas, a big question with climate change, and I do think that has been a trigger for cooperation. Somebody put it, it's a common thread, is people need to know, what the future is like with the melting glaciers, melting snow, changes in river rainfall. So I think that production of science and cooperation on science is something that's appreciated by the different countries who share the mountains. So there are opportunities like that, and that I think has been quite a good success of working together on mountain issues.
Thank you very much. Aysegul, how is this production of knowledge in the Tigris and Euphrates basins?
I was thinking about the question, the bilateral agreements and the multilateral one. The knowledge base, I try to give the example that there has been a great experience and knowledge built between the interstate negotiations between the bureaucrats and technocrats. But in addition to that, the professionals, academics, and some part of private sector and civil society also took the opportunities to build the Track 2 initiatives to deal with this difficult basin, because they tried to build, like the example of ETIC, the Euphrates Tigris Initiative for Cooperation. They tried to make the opportunities for cooperation broader and create areas for cooperation, for water, for development, for sustainable development. And also they tried to bring these Track 2 initiatives, like how the riparians can share their experiences, because there have been many years and decades that the bureaucracies or farmers or industrialists or water users, they did not have much contact in this basin because of the political divisions. So these Track 2 initiatives try to bring together how they deal with the water scarcity shortages, or how they manage their agricultural water use, irrigation management, and the issues that can be shared, the lessons and the experiences. So knowledge base is very, very significant here. The recent one is the Blue Peace in the Middle East, and it comprises not only Euphrates and Tigris, but riparians from Jordan and to some extent from other river basins in the Middle East as well. And they have been dealing in this Track 2 initiative together with professionals, also active politicians or bureaucrats and academics, to find out less contentious issues like how to efficiently manage water or deal with climate change, or the nexus between energy, water, and food and environment. This initiative, like the Blue Peace since 2010, is very promising because they try to strive all through the episodes of political challenges. So knowledge base is building up. That's why we call here as an imperfect peace in the basin. Peace is always threatened and challenged and broken, but still the cooperation tracks are striving.
Thank you. So these two are international examples, David and Aysegul. Neil, if we come to United States, how much have you seen knowledge being created?
Well, it's an interesting question because there's a lot of changes in that area. And the United States has a lot of experiments that it has tried to make in development of knowledge networks. going back to the 1950s when we had a lot of legislative initiatives during the Great Society of the 1960s. They established a network of state water resources research institutes. Unfortunately, though, when a more conservative government came on board, they would usually not see much of a role for institutions like that, and so they would not fund them anymore. And so we've had a lot of examples of starting up and closing down. But fortunately, there's still people who have initiative who see the need to do it. And with our very diverse set of non-governmental institutions that we have in the United States, in many cases, they're interest groups and not university-based operations. We have a pretty robust set of conferences and, assistance for the decision makers, all in the background. And so I think in general, when you add it all up, it's pretty healthy, but it's not organized in any centralized way. The last comment I would have, though, about that is things may begin to change now with the internet, the social media, and all these different ways to communicate and share information. If we can have leaders that'll come out and who can see the vision that we're talking about here to set up those knowledge networks and use those modern tools, I think we can solve some problems now that we could not have solved in the past when information was hidden a lot and so difficult to access. So it's a complicated question, Cecilia, but I think we have reason for optimism on it.
Yes, very much, yes. And let me go now to Srinivas. There is a question for you. However much the science of allocation improves in a catchment like the Cauveys, it is not politically accepted. I wouldn't say is there any way to resolve it, but what would be the ways to resolve it?
Well, just before I respond to this question, there's a quick comment on the question that you posed to Neil. It's at least when in the context of India, it's the knowledge networks would have impact. If and not, it depends on the impact or effectiveness of the knowledge networks would depend on who's producing the knowledge. Every state would have their own, set of ways of producing the knowledge, and then that is deployed against the other states' claims, and that itself becomes a dispute, over the knowledge itself. So that's another, complex dimension to the interstate river water disputes in India. Now, coming to that, that is related to the question that is posed to me about however much the science of allocation improves. What is the other levers? It's very difficult to respond to that. We can't really look at a lever or a set of levers. But what we realized after working on the interstate disputes and enabling cooperation as well, when we looked at it, we realized that we can't look at it as simply resolving disputes or simply enabling cooperation between states. What we felt was that it needs to be the challenge of interstate river water disputes resolution needs to be located in the larger frame of federal governance. And then you need to consider various elements with respect to policy, legal, financial, and other judicial instruments that you can deploy to ensure that the interstate dispute resolution or otherwise enabling cooperation could work. That itself is a bigger gap that we realize. So just to respond, the short response is that you need to definitely look at multiple levers, but it needs to go beyond simply dispute resolution.
Thank you. There's also a question for you, David. And David, would you characterize the process as being stonewalled when it reaches track one dialogue over the Hindukush Himalaya when it comes to binding multilateral agreements?
I'm not sure the right word to use. Certainly, it's quite difficult to get track one type dialogue agreements. But I think that it changes over time. right? So in between countries, that situation can change. And I think the idea is that being there for a long term and giving the opportunity, I think when the opportunity arises, at least you're ready to act and to try to get some more concrete agreements between the countries. But yeah, it's quite difficult now, but there's always hope in the future. Something will change and we can move forward.
What happens, and this is a question for four of you, what opportunity climate change brings us? Because yes, the situation is difficult, yes, we have to develop different mechanisms, but it's an opportunity. Perhaps because it's a common threat, a common situation. But what opportunity does it bring us? Something that we could look at from the scientific point of view, from the knowledge point of view, from the collaboration point of view. If I could start with Neil, please. You're muted, Neil.
Yes. Could you repeat that for me, Cecilia, really quickly?
Of course, what opportunities climate change brings for better management, for better collaboration?
Well, in our case, with our case study on the Colorado River, everybody was going along in a kind of a lackadaisical way when everything was great. But what the climate change does is it provides a wake-up call, and because it's like a crisis that has developed, and it stimulates new thinking and action. And so in that sense, it's a good thing. Someone said that already. Maybe you said that, Cecilia, about climate. The good news about climate change is this. And I think in the case that I'm referring to there, that's the main lesson. It's going to give us some new energy to look at it.
Thank you. Sigul, could you also comment on that? You already explained that there have been concessions from some of the countries to others temporarily. But if we look towards the future, if we think on a more, not temporary, but on a more permanent solution, given that climate change impacts will only increase, what opportunities do countries have?
Well, yeah, it brings the urgency, like disaster management. Droughts are not like sudden disasters. It happens in a prolonged time and severely, but it comes to unbearable situation. And when it comes to unbearable situations, or for seasons, or for farmers, or for the governments, they try to look for dialogue with the neighbors. So it brings the urgency, and it inevitably brings the continuation of dialogue. But about the permanent and systematic response, I'm not very hopeful, because so far the governments are short-sighted, and they look for their election periods, and they don't give too much attention to the considerable terms like medium term or long term responses to climate change. But in humanitarian terms, yeah, they try to help each other when it comes to floods, dealing with floods, dealing with like earthquakes. We have seen in Turkey that dozens of countries come to help through the neighbors, but this is not systematic, and climate change is with us for I don't know how long for, but so far I'm not hopeful about them. So I think when it comes to permanency, we need civil society's engagement, more power, empowerment, and their influence in the political choices, and the possibility of them really having a participation in dealing with climate change.
Thank you. Srinivas, your comments on this, given the very complex situation in India?
Well, I did comment on that earlier on the interstate cooperation or interstate response, federal response to climate change. But I would like to sort of comment on the the response within South Asia. I mean, you are familiar with the way the South Asian nations have. I'm sure David would be able to relate to it. The South Asian nations have responded to this UN Convention on on non-navigational water courses, which is 1997. It's quite uneven, and it is because of the kind of history of bilateral agreements or otherwise bilateral relationships. But the climate change, even though within that crisis we can hope for, is because there is certain amount of sense of need for transboundary cooperation within South Asia. I can give you an example of Indian response. Is that in the recent, the Parliament has had this standing committee that wanted it to look at the GLOFs, glacial. It was glacially produced floods. And as a response to GLOFs, the Standing Committee has recommended that India has to invest in strengthening its transboundary relationships. And that is how you see it. It is not necessarily that you see clear collective action, but there is a reason why the nations have to respond, because they need to work with their neighbors to deal with some of these risks like GLOFs. So I would see that, yes, climate change definitely offers certain kind of hope for a greater cooperation or better collective action between nations.
David, do we have precise examples where you have seen this cooperation happening in different forms?
Yeah. By the way, so and I wanted to react. Srinivas was saying different parties have different, states have different, produce science differently. We used a technique called an assessment of what happens in climate change across the 8 countries. So that brought in scientists from the 8 countries and beyond to agree on what's happening with climate change in the mountains, right? So, and okay, they might disagree on many things, but at least you write what they agree, and that's a great starting point. Then I think the issue that's come up a lot is the floods and the disasters. And I remember exactly that, getting calls from, there's a GLOF in China, Glacier Lake outburst and flood in China. Is that going to impact India? I remember that distinctly coming up as an example. I remember people, looking at the models, flood on the Koshi River, what's going to happen in Bihar. So people are starting, really worried about the flood. I think there's examples of China and India on the Brahmaputra River, China giving signals to India when the flood is coming. I remember talking to diplomats, he said, we can't give water information, but we can give you the signal that the flood is coming. So I thought that was wonderful. And I think communities, community to community have gotten together and say, hey, we have this early warning system. Why don't you try it in your country as well? So I think the floods, disasters is terrible, but also a chance we should use to bring people together.
You're right, to bring people together and to develop systems, right? Like the early warning systems. How do we understand them? How can we benefit from them in different countries, in different basins?
Yeah, I think that's right. The early, you need that upstream, downstream to get the early warning system. So that would be an area that you could see more and more cooperation in a more formal way. That would be my hope. I think what we tried to do with that assessment is then get what we call the science policy dialogue, and it's in place where we have the ministers, kind of of the 8 countries getting together and are able to respond at a more formal level. But I would expect that dealing with disasters would come up, as a doable part of that agenda between countries.
Thank you. So we're coming to an end. If I would appreciate if each one of you give us your final thoughts. If we can start with Aysegul, please.
Yeah. Specifically related to the Euphrates and Tigris basin, I strongly recommend to build on the existing formal and informal institutions and make them better by involving all relevant and related stakeholders and sectors systematically, and also dealing with this urgency of climate change. This is the way to deal with through the institutions, through cooperation, in various levels, starting from local to international. So I just look for multilateral regimes, but there was a question there about whether it would work maybe with bilateral. In my case, we didn't see much progress in the bilateral cooperation. That's why I emphasize that all relevant stakeholders, not only interstate governments, but also the other stakeholders should come together to deal with these problems in such basins. So my conclusion should be multilateralism, even though it is very challenging.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Srinivas.
Well, well, I would, one of those things that I would like to emphasize in these final remarks is that, the dispute resolutions or the reduction of adverse consequences or, avoiding escalation of these disputes to a point of becoming national spectacles, is that, we need to build on the track record that I mentioned about the rich history of interstate cooperation. And that it's about learning from the track record of interstate cooperation to understand what really works when it comes to interstate cooperation and how it can inform the right kind of institutional design. And I think that's one of the key things that I would emphasize. And besides that, I think we need to, as I did mention earlier, is also to locate this interstate disputes resolution and enabling cooperation in the much larger ecosystem of federal governance. And then that, when it comes to India, there are a bunch of key foundational changes that are required. One, on building the knowledge networks that are accountable and that are legitimate, and at the same time, but also certain kind of consensus building on the roles of center and the states when it comes to resolving disputes. So I guess they would become very specific to India, and I would stop at this point.
Thank you. Neil, could you please give us your final thoughts?
Yes, the thought that comes to my mind is the difference between the institutional framework that we're working in the United States and those of most of the other examples. Since the United States is one of a few, really large countries with many different subdivisions like India and China and so on, our experience is different than it would be if we were trying to network among a group of smaller countries with different institutional arrangements. So here in the United States, what we've been finding out is that these interstate and transboundary situations test our institutional framework in a lot of ways. And of course, right now, in many ways, the United States is undergoing numerous political crises in different sectors. And the water sector is relatively quiet compared to many of the others. But when you look inside of the lessons that we've learned about these institutional frameworks, it is that you need to have some ways that are kind of soft, so to speak, where negotiations can occur between parties with these conflicting objectives. And these have to be worked out almost like in a case-by-case basin. Srinivas showed the difference between the state government boundaries and the river basins in India. We have the same problem here. So how do you work out the institutions when they don't always fit? Some scientists call that the problem of fit, between the river basins and the jurisdictional boundaries. Last thing I would say is there has been a good bit of discussion today about what the ultimate authority might be to resolve a lot of these disputes. Here in the United States, the ultimate authority to resolve various legal disputes is our Supreme Court, which has been under attack for a lot of things recently. But I've been surprised at how active they've been over the years in engaging in these water disputes. And they have a way of appointing what they call special masters to hold tribunals, and it's a little known aspect of this highest level of judicial authority to work out these water disputes. So that's a few things.
Different ways, but And of course, in the United States, it has all these institutions that are needed to resolve disputes.
Yeah.
And David, yeah, we end with you, your final thoughts.
I thought this was fantastic, hearing the different experiences from different places in the world, and I do think that some of what resonated to me was in all the cases there that kind of cooperation, communication, joint science plays an important role in moving forward. Yes, we struggle on a kind of the dispute resolution, but maybe it's something we can concentrate on in the future about knowledge sharing across different settings of solving these transboundary water issues. The second thing that came up for me is the climate change, and that we all need to address it. And I think there is people are willing to address it. And maybe that's a good trigger for us all to get together and kind of share our experiences and have a way that countries can go and say, how did you, in your situation, resolve this? So I think this seminar was great, and bringing, yes, differences, but commonalities and approaches. And I'd like to thank you all for organizing this.
Thank you very much. So with this, we leave with institutional frameworks, the positive aspect, that is what there is a lot of it, governance aspects, knowledge networks, as Srinivas says, that are accountable, the consensus buildings. How do we build? And I like this very much, these knowledge settings in different situations. So thank you very much to all of you again, Neil, David, Aysegul, and Srinivas. And for our audience, we will see you again in March, this time with a discussion on the role of the media in water management, in water security. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.